everybody. This is a very special edition of the Credit Union Connection. I'm here with Henry Meyer of law firm of Henry Meyer. And we're here today. We're just going to talk really quick about what the heck is going on with the NCUA board. You all know Henry from being here in the past as one of my repeat offender guests. Welcome, Henry. I want to hear everything you've got to say about this craziness going on at NCUA.
Welcome, Sarah, and thanks for having me back. As usual, I love to be on. So thank you. This is a very interesting, but unfortunately not unique to NCUA situation. Okay, so if we could put this in context, yesterday, Chairman, well, I'll put it back even further for those of you not keeping score at home. Um, if you remember, Chairman Harper and board member Tsuka were removed from the board, okay, by the Trump administration. They sued, claiming that on several grounds, including that the um, removal was both unconstitutional and illegal as a matter of statutory interpretation. They won that case yesterday before the D.C. District Court. It was the judge basically accepted every single one of their major arguments, and as a result, they are now. They would argue that they are entitled to be active board members, and they have to be reinstated to the NCUA board. Now, the Trump administration in these situations has, of course, appealed. Now, here's where we get into the Alice in Wonderland world of what's called the shadow docket. Okay,
Okay.
if I could put this in context, we all are extremely aware of the normal, quote unquote, Supreme Court process. You and I disagree, Sarah. We sue each other. We one of us wins. That gets appealed, and if we think we could still win, we can appeal to the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court accepts the case, you get a nice written decision. Okay, explaining what side wins. The shadow docket is basically everything else that doesn't come into that neat group. But there is also a subset of the shadow docket called the emergency docket, in which is becoming increasingly used by the appellate system and by the Supreme Court itself. It used to be limited to death penalty cases because clearly, if I'm dead, the merits of my appeal won't be of much use to me if the court rules for me after the fact. So exactly, there's a certain logic to this. But now we're seeing applied to a whole bunch of situations. So my guess is that what you're going to see happening, and what you already are seeing happening, is this: the Trump administration this morning asked for a stay of the judge's ruling, which said that they're entitled to be back on the board. And by the way, there's a board meeting tomorrow, and they said you're entitled to be there. The Trump administration, based on my reading of the docket, asked that be stayed. In other words, let's not put that into effect until we get to appeal it. The court said, no, that's not necessary. And right now, last I checked about 40 minutes ago, that in itself is being appealed as well. So this is another example of that shadow docket where the ultimate question is not so much the merits of the argument at this point, but whether or not the Trump administration is going to be allowed to freeze the order to reinstate the board members pending the resolution of the appeal.
So why the emergency docket become so important all of a sudden?
Because it's being used over the last 10, 13 years, let's say 10, 15 years, to an extent that it was not previously used. And then it was supercharged, frankly, in the latter part of the first Trump administration. And not to be partisan about this, now both sides will do it if they think it's to their advantage. But as a result, think of how tough this is for us. Like, my job is to advise credit unions on the law. Okay. And increasingly, you're getting these major decisions being made that have substantial impact without a written decision. No matter who wins this fight tonight over the order itself, no one has time to write a 15, 20-page decision. It will be a sentence or one sentence saying that no, they are going to be reinstated and they can show up tomorrow, or hold on, we're going to hold up on this. So it's a really unique and in some ways troubling development within the system, because the bottom line is, whether you agree or disagree with what side you agree with, I think we should all agree that there should be some written explanation for why something is being done. As soon as you make these time sensitive issues, though, um, that goes out the window. And the court in recent years has been willing to accept the argument that apparently any time the government is denied action that it would want to take, that can be an emergency situation.
Now, the Supreme Court, the only case I remember hearing of related to Cranes going to the Supreme Court was field of membership way back. Am I missing any? Do a lot of Crane cases go to the Supreme Court?
This is the only one that I'm. You put me on the spot there. So my guess is the only one I'm aware of. I'm not going to say the only
Mm-hmm.
one, but the only one I'm aware of is, of course, the Credit Union Membership Access Act.
Yeah.
When I say the Supreme Court, it will either go to the Supreme Court on the settled docket, or at some point, if the appellate division comes to a different conclusion, and depending on how they, it could be settled today in terms of the appellate structure. Excuse me,
Right.
in terms of the procedural posture. But
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, one way or the other, I've always told you, um, this is going to end up before the Supreme Court, probably with a bunch of other cases that basically test the same issue. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
there's there's two fundamental issues going on here, which are, which one, the first issue is there's a case called Humphrey Executive. Okay, going back to 1935 or in that area, President Roosevelt wanted to remove the chairman of the FTC. Okay. He said, you can't do that. I have a fixed term. Okay. And President Roosevelt made an argument very similar to the one being advanced by the Trump administration. He says, I'm the executive power is vested in me, and I can get remove who I want to remove. And the Supreme Court said, no, we're going to make an exception when you're not, when the agency in question, there's more adjudicatory in judge stuff than
Yep.
traditional agency stuff. We're going to give that agency deference. Now, over the years, that's been expanded to the extent that basically, if Congress wants to set up an independent agency, it's called, they're allowed to do so. Okay, the conservative movement has always raised questions about that. As you can see, it doesn't have to be conservative either. President Roosevelt was no conservative. Okay,
Yeah.
um, but starting with what the court said in its CFPB decision, in which it validated a single board and said that, hey, that director has to be a single director, and it said that that director had to be subject to the oversight of the presidency of the president. Then it wasn't too much of a leap to say, let's begin questioning this whole concept that of Humphrey's executive. So that's the constitutional issue. And then you have the more pedestrian but just as important question of, what did Congress intend when it set up the current structure for the NCUA in 1978? For those of you who don't know, it actually is a really interesting story. In 1976, uh, the board member, the NCUA was basically overseen by a single member, a single director with a volunteer advisory board, I would call it. He complains to Congress that the system is not good because he could be fired at any time. President Ford accommodates him by firing him within 3 hours of that comment, or a day of that comment. I don't want to exaggerate. And then there's a whole, and so in response to that, the Congress passes a new structure, three-member board with fixed terms, that is much more analogous to independent agencies than the NCUA previously had. Now, as a result of this research and this litigation, what we've now come to realize, and maybe people realized it but never thought it would be an issue, is that there are certain terms and catchphrases you look for in the statutes when we're dealing with independent agencies that are supposed to be given some protection from removal. In other words, for cause removal. That term for cause, for instance, is not in the NCUA statute. So the
Mm-hmm.
question the court had to decide was, you know, first of all, is Humphrey still good with law? It said until the Supreme Court decides otherwise, I say it is, and he has to respect precedent, so I understand that. And then he's saying, as a matter of statutory interpretation, you have to look at this statute in the context of why it was created. And clearly, this was done in response to the removal by President Ford of the directive, and now the purpose was to give people protection against precisely what's going on here. That's the
Mhm.
argument made by the board members, and that's the one that this court accepted, but it is going to be appealed, and we have not heard the final word at all. This is just the first battle in what's going to be a very what's going to be a really big fight.
Mhm. And what are your final thoughts? How's this going to affect credit unions going in the
Well,
immediate term?
that's the bottom line, right? Like if it was just an academic issue, it would be fun for law professors and people like me. But what does it matter? And really, the question is, well, does what can the NCUA do right now? Uh, for instance, a few weeks ago, the NCUA joined with other agencies in exempting certain BSA requirements regarding the collection of TINs. Well, taxpayer identification numbers. Well, what's the status of that? Um, what's the status of mergers? And really, these are all open questions that the longer this goes on, they're going to raise issues as to, and it is going to, so it's going to stifle to the extent you need to think that there's stuff that has to be done. This doesn't help. Okay,
Mhm.
that's the most practical impact. I would um, put a suggestion out to my fellow credit union people um, that some people are saying, Henry, let's be honest about this. We wanted mandate relief. This is the ultimate mandate relief. And I understand that in the short to medium term. But my only thing I want to remind you is if you're okay with President Trump having this, or the executive branch with this president having this much power, would you be as comfortable with a President Sanders having the same power? And to
Mhm.
the extent you can answer that honestly and say, okay, I'm fine with that, then we all have a stake in making sure we have a stable, methodical legislative, judicial, and regulatory process. And right now, it's questionable if that the system is fraying.
Mhm. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time and your insight, Henry. Appreciate it. We'll have you back on when there's the next movement in the case.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I think everyone's tuning in to tomorrow's board meeting to see what happens. It could be the most exciting event on C-SPAN since it could be C-SPAN's equivalent of Muhammad Ali versus Frazier.
Pay per
So
view. It's got to be pay per view.
pay-per-view event.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Frank.
sir.